Welcome back to another deep dive.
Hello.
If you are joining us today, you are in for a conversation that I think it's going to fundamentally shift how you view your own body.
Oh, absolutely.
We are looking at this massive stack of research today. Clinical trials, clinical notes. We're collectively calling this the blueprint for biological longevity and cellular vitality.
It's a heavy stack.
It is. And before we even get into the weeds of this data, I want to speak directly to you, wherever you are listening from right now. Our mission for this deep dive, it isn't just about figuring out how to tack a few extra fragile years onto the end of your life.
Right, not just surviving.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are talking about adding absolute, unapologetic vitality to the years you are living right now. We are exploring the intersection of molecular biology, cutting-edge clinical findings, and some truly radical personal health transformations.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Because whether you are an elite athlete trying to shave seconds off a personal best, a busy parent who is just trying to keep up with a toddler, or someone who is feeling mysteriously deeply exhausted all the time and just can't figure out why.
Which is a lot of people.
So many people. The manual for your biology has just been updated.
It absolutely has been updated. And as we transition into this material, I think it's crucial to set the proper stage.
Yeah.
If we look at the blueprints of human cellular structures, these incredibly complex, glowing networks that keep us upright and functioning, we have to accept one overarching truth right out of the gate.
And with that?
Longevity is not a single magic pill. You can't just hack your way to vitality with one weird trick. It's a systemic symphony. Every single organ, every hormone, every microscopic cell is playing a part in this orchestra.
I love that.
And the research we are diving into today shows us that we actually have the baton. We have the ability to conduct that symphony and change the expression of our health at a foundational level.
I really love that visual of the symphony. And to understand how the whole orchestra plays together, we really have to start down in the engine room.
The basement.
The basement, yeah. We have to look at the foundational level of human energy. So let's start with the cells. Specifically, we're looking at the mitochondria. Our sources highlight the clinical findings of Dr. Elizabeth Yerth, and she focuses on what she calls the great energy crisis of aging.
Right.
She drops a statistic early on in this research that, honestly, it made me do a double take.
It's a scary one.
It really is.
Yeah.
She states that by the time humans reach the age of 65, we experience a 60% loss of our mitochondria.
60%.
60%. I mean, I'm trying to wrap my head around what that actual structural loss feels like on a day-to-day basis.
Well, to understand what it feels like, you have to look at what mitochondria actually do. We learn in high school biology that they're the powerhouse of the cell.
Right, the powerhouse.
But practically speaking, they produce ATP. That is the energetic currency that every single biological process in your body requires to run. Losing 60% of those engines it's like trying to power a massive 20-room mansion with a single AA battery.
Wow, so the lights are just going to dim.
Exactly. The lights dim, the high-energy appliances shut down, the security system fails. Your body simply cannot perform its basic overnight maintenance, let alone allow you to thrive and build new tissue when it is operating at a 60% energy deficit.
That makes so much sense.
This is why people in their 60s often describe a deep, bone-level fatigue that sleep just doesn't fix. The battery is just fundamentally smaller.
The battery is smaller. That analogy is perfect. But the encouraging part of Dr. Yerth's findings is that she doesn't just leave us with this terrifying statistic about losing our cellular engines.
No, she gives a roadmap.
She provides a specific protocol to combat it. And the specific molecules she uses in her clinical practice are really interesting. She outlines a daily regimen using alpha-ketoglutarate at about 2 to 3 grams, urolithin A at 1 gram, and spermidine at 20 milligrams.
Right.
Now, I want to zero in on urolithin A because the notes mention it clears out dead mitochondria. But why doesn't the body just do that naturally? Why do we need a supplement to take out the cellular trash?
That's a great question. In a youthful body, there is a natural process called mitophagy. It's an elegant biological mechanism where the cell identifies a damaged, sputtering mitochondrion, breaks it down, and recycles the parts.
Okay.
But as we age, that specific surveillance system starts to fail.
So the garbage just piles up.
Precisely. Imagine a factory floor where the machines break down, but the janitorial staff has gone on strike.
Oh, wow.
The broken machines don't just disappear. They sit there taking up space, rusting, and in the case of our cells, they leak free radicals and create chronic oxidative stress.
That sounds terrible.
It is. What urolithin A does, specifically at that 1 gram clinical dose, is it reawakens the janitorial staff. It acts as a powerful signaling molecule that forcefully triggers mitophagy.
Oh, okay.
It sweeps the factory floor clean, which is the mandatory first step before the cell can even think about building fresh, efficient new engines.
Okay, so urolithin A is the demolition crew clearing the site.
Exactly.
But to build new engines, you obviously need raw materials. And this is where Dr. Yurth points to a very specific clinical marker that most people might not associate with cellular energy, which is ferritin.
Right, iron storage.
Yeah, she notes that your ferritin has to be between 65 and 100. Why is iron so critical here?
Because iron is a non-negotiable component of the electron transport chain inside the mitochondria. You can think of the electron transport chain like a biological assembly line that physically manufactures the ATP energy. You can have a brand new, beautifully clean factory floor, but if you don't have iron, the assembly line grinds to a halt. If your ferritin drops too low, ATP production simply cannot happen, regardless of what other supplements you are taking.
Which makes getting comprehensive blood work so vital.
Absolutely vital.
But as I was reading through Dr. Yurth's section on clinical markers, I hit a massive point of friction. I actually had to reread the notes because it went against everything I've ever been told by a doctor.
Oh, the lipid panel stuff?
Yes. She talks about uric acid and triglycerides. Now, I always assumed, and I think most people assume, that having rock-bottom triglycerides is the ultimate goal. Your doctor usually gives you a high five if those numbers are super low.
They do.
But Dr. Yurth argues that if your uric acid is under 4.5 or your triglycerides are under 65, it is actually a massive red flag.
Yeah.
Why would low triglycerides be a bad thing?
What's fascinating here is that it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what these molecules actually do in the human body. We've been conditioned to view all fats and all acids as enemies to be eradicated. Triglycerides are essentially circulating packets of fuel. Your body, especially your heart and your skeletal muscles, relies on them for sustained energy. Uric acid, when kept in the proper physiological range, is actually one of the most potent antioxidants functioning in the brain.
So if they drop too low, you're essentially running on fumes.
Worse than fumes. When those numbers drop into the basement, under 65 for triglycerides and under 4.5 for uric acid, it is a clinical indicator of a profound mitochondrial deficit state.
Wow.
It means your body's energy production is so impaired and it is so starved for basic fuel that it is stripping your bloodstream bare just to keep the lights on. It's not a sign of optimal health. It's a sign of a failing system.
And the notes link those specific low numbers directly to cognitive decline, which is terrifying.
It makes perfect biological sense, though. The brain is the most energy-hungry organ in the entire body. It weighs about 2% of your total body mass, but it demands 20% of your energy.
That's a huge ratio.
Right. If your systemic energy production is failing and your bloodstream is depleted of circulating fuel, the brain is the very first organ to suffer the consequences.
So you could walk out of a standard physical thinking you are in peak health because your lipid panel is aggressively low while your brain is actually quietly starving.
Exactly.
That is a massive paradigm shift. And it brings us directly to the next researcher on this stack, Dr. Natalie Yevgeohana. Because if the mitochondria are the engines, we need to talk about how we are actually fueling them day to day. Dr. Yevgeohana focuses on reprogramming the cellular engine by shifting our primary dietary fuel source. Her findings suggest that moving away from carbohydrates and shifting to free fatty acids, so eating more nuts, avocado, high-quality olive oil, literally forces our cells to multiply their mitochondria.
Right.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second. For decades, the dietary consensus was that eating fat makes you sluggish and clogs up the system. How does eating a denser, heavier fuel like fat actually build more energy engines?
It comes down to metabolic math and adaptive stress. Burning carbohydrates for fuel is a very easy, low-effort process for a cell. It's quick, readily available energy.
Like kindling on a fire.
Yes. But a fat molecule is much larger and vastly more complex. It requires significantly more cellular machinery to break it down and extract the energy.
So it's like asking a four-cylinder engine to suddenly pull a massive freight trailer.
Exactly. When you restrict carbohydrates and force the cell to rely primarily on free fatty acids, the cell recognizes that its current mitochondrial capacity isn't strong enough to handle the workload. It experiences a mild, healthy form of stress called hormesis.
Okay.
In response to that stress, it adapts. It triggers a process called mitochondrial biogenesis. The cell is literally forced to build more engines just to handle the heavy lifting of metabolizing the fat. By feeding the body a harder-to-burn fuel, you are effectively sending a biological mandate to upgrade the power grid.
That is fascinating. The body adapts to the demands you place on it. But Dr. Johanna isn't just studying diet. The notes outline her clinical trials involving something called Pearson syndrome.
Yes.
And reading through this section was incredibly emotional. For those listening who might not be familiar, what exactly is Pearson syndrome and what is she doing that is so groundbreaking here?
Pearson syndrome is an incredibly rare, devastating, and typically fatal genetic mitochondrial disease. Children born with this condition have a genetic defect coded directly into their mitochondria. Their cellular engines are broken from the moment they are born.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. They suffer from severe energy deficits that lead to progressive organ failure, typically starting with the bone marrow and the kidneys. Historically, this was considered a largely untreatable condition because how do you fix a defect that exists inside the microscopic power plants of every cell in a child's body?
Right. It seems structurally impossible to reach. But her protocol reads like something out of a science fiction novel. She's taking healthy mitochondria from the child's mother and transplanting them directly into the child's blood stem cells.
Yes. It's a procedure called mitochondrial augmentation therapy. She takes hematopoietic stem cells, which are the master cells in the bone marrow that create all other blood cells from the child. She then extracts healthy, fully functioning mitochondria from the mother's cells.
Okay.
In a lab, she essentially infuses those healthy maternal engines into the child's stem cells and then gives those supercharged stem cells back to the child.
And the clinical results mentioned in these notes are just awe-inspiring. We are talking about children who were entirely wheelchair-bound, who simply did not have the cellular energy to stand, suddenly gaining the strength to get up and walk.
It's incredible.
Children who were in progressive end-stage kidney failure, and the disease progression just halted. It stopped in its tracks.
It is one of the most profound leaps in medical science we've seen in recent years. But what I want the listener to take away from this isn't just the miracle of this specific rare disease treatment, it's the broader implication for human biology.
Right, because most of us don't have Pearson syndrome.
Exactly. But what this clinical trial unequivocally proves is the sheer malleability of our cellular destiny. It proves that mitochondrial dysfunction is not a permanent, unbreakable life sentence.
That's a huge relief.
If medical science can literally transplant fresh engines into the cells of a child with a fatal genetic disease and reverse acute organ failure, imagine what you can do for the average person who is just experiencing that standard 60% age-related decline. It completely validates the idea that our foundational biology is plastic and it responds dramatically to intervention.
It gives you an immense sense of hope. You're not just stuck with a degrading battery, but to keep those engines running optimally, whether they are new or old, we have to look at the environment they are operating in. And this is where Dr. Scott Scherr's work comes in. He focuses heavily on the nervous system's role in energy production. He uses a phrase that I think a lot of people listening will resonate with. He talks about exiting the sympathetic spiral of doom. I know a lot of people who live their entire lives in that spiral.
We all do, to some extent. The modern world is perfectly designed to keep us there. The sympathetic nervous system is your classic fight-or-flight response. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is designed for brief, intense bursts of survival, like running away from a predator. When that system is activated, the brain diverts all available energy away from long-term maintenance, away from digestion, away from cellular repair, and pushes it entirely toward immediate survival.
Which makes sense if a tiger is chasing you.
Right. But today, the tiger is a stressful email from your boss at 10 p.m. The tiger is gridlock traffic. The tiger is a constant stream of anxiety-inducing news on your phone. If you are chronically locked in that sympathetic state, your cells are never receiving the biological signal that it is safe to heal. They are never receiving the signal to undergo that mitochondrial biogenesis we just talked about. Dr. Scherr argues, quite correctly, that you cannot fundamentally fix your cellular energy if your nervous system is constantly screaming that you are in mortal danger.
So how do you hit the brakes on that? Because his actionable advice here is surprisingly simple. He talks about specific breathwork techniques, or even just humming, just walking around your house humming a song. How does something that simple override a biological survival mechanism?
It all comes down to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the superhighway of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your rest and digest state. It wanders from the brainstem all the way down through the chest interfacing with the heart, the lungs, and the digestive tract.
Huh.
Physical vibrations like the deep resonance created in the throat and chest when you hum, or the rhythmic expansion of the diaphragm during deep breath work, physically stimulate that nerve.
So you are mechanically massaging the brake pedal.
Exactly. You are sending an immediate physical signal up that superhighway to the brain, telling it that the environment is safe. You can't hum if you're running from a predator. By stimulating the vagus nerve, you force the nervous system to downregulate, which finally allows the body to allocate energy towards cellular repair.
And the importance of getting that stress state under control ties directly into how our bodies process other medical treatments.
Yeah.
There is a specific patient story in Dr. Scher's clinical notes that I want to dissect. He talks about a colleague's patient who was suffering from profound exhaustion. The doctors put her on hormone replacement therapy, HRT.
Right.
Now, conventionally, we are taught that balancing your hormones is the ultimate silver bullet for aging and fatigue. But this patient, despite having her hormones perfectly dialed in on paper, still felt absolutely terrible. The HRT did nothing for her. Why?
This is a phenomenal example of a critical blind spot in modern medicine. We have to remember what hormones actually are. They are messengers. They travel through the bloodstream, they find a specific cell, they knock on the cell's door, and they deliver an instruction like build muscle or burn fat.
Okay, so the messengers are circulating.
Yes, the HRT provided the messengers. But if the cell's mitochondrial engine is broken, or if the cell is completely bogged down by the oxidative stress of being stuck in that sympathetic spiral of doom, it doesn't matter how loud the hormone knocks.
They can't answer the door.
Exactly. The cell simply does not have the ATP energy required to open the door, read the message, and carry out the instruction. Hormones are entirely dependent on mitochondrial health to function.
So what was the intervention for this patient? The notes say they added a microdose of a compound called methylene blue, and the transformation was apparently overnight. Within days, her energy returned, her brain fog lifted, and the HRT finally started working. What exactly is methylene blue doing at a microscopic level to cause that rapid of a shift?
Methylene blue is an incredibly unique synthetic compound. When used at a very specific microdose level, it acts as an electron donor directly inside the mitochondria.
Wait, translate that for me. An electron donor.
Think back to our assembly line analogy for the electron transport chain. Sometimes, as we age or experience high stress, the workers on that assembly line get sluggish and drop the parts.
Right.
Methylene blue essentially steps onto the assembly line and hands the electrons directly to the final stage of the process. It physically bypasses the broken or sluggish parts of the engine and ensures that ATP gets produced regardless. And while it's doing that, it also acts as a powerful antioxidant, mopping up the cellular exhaust.
So it forces the engine to run while simultaneously cleaning it.
Exactly. By adding that microdose, they instantly boosted her cellular energy and cleared the oxidative stress. Suddenly, her cells had the power to answer the door when the HRT knocked. The messengers finally had a working factory to command.
It just beautifully illustrates how interconnected this entire symphony is. We've spent all this time talking about the cellular engines and the nervous system that houses them. But engines are ultimately useless if you are putting the wrong fuel in the tank. Which leads us to a really natural pivot point in our blueprint today. Let's talk about the fuel system. We are shifting from microscopic cellular energy to systemic metabolic health, fasting, and how we build muscle.
And this is a mandatory transition because you can have perfectly healthy mitochondria, you can be humming all day to calm your vagus nerve, but if you are continuously flooding your system with the wrong type of fuel, or if the hormonal signals managing that fuel are corrupted, the entire biological machine will still break down.
And to really understand this fuel system, we have to look at the work of Dr. Jason Fung. He completely reframes how we are taught to think about weight gain, weight loss, and metabolism. For decades, the golden rule has been calories in, calories out. But Dr. Fung argues that regulating your weight is not about counting calories at all. He introduces the concept of the body fat thermostat and argues that weight management is fundamentally about managing hormones, specifically insulin.
The calorie in, calorie out model is a massive oversimplification that has, frankly, failed millions of people. It treats the human body like a simple bomb calorimeter, a machine that just burns whatever you throw into it. But the body is vastly more complex. It operates based on a hierarchy of hormonal signals.
And insulin is at the top of that hierarchy.
Absolutely. Insulin is the primary storage hormone. When you eat, especially carbohydrates, your insulin spikes to shuttle that energy into the cells. But when insulin levels are high, your body is biologically locked into storage mode. It firmly shuts the door on your fat cells and refuses to burn stored fat, regardless of how few calories you are consuming. Dr. Fung's work proves that you have to shift your focus away from the sheer quantity of the fuel and instead focus on the hormonal response generated by the quality of the fuel.
And when we talk about the quality of the fuel, Dr. Fung takes a very aggressive stance against ultra-processed foods.
Yeah.
But what I appreciate about his research is that he doesn't just call them junk food and leave it at that. He breaks down the actual neurophysiology of why these foods are uniquely destructive. He explains that they are scientifically engineered to artificially spike dopamine in the brain, while completely bypassing our natural satiety hormones, specifically GLP-1 and peptide YY.
This requires a total paradigm shift in how we view cravings and overeating. Ultra-processed foods, the chips, the cookies, the fast food, they are not just food, they are meticulously formulated industrial products designed to hijack your neurochemistry. When you eat them, they deliver an unnatural, massive hit of dopamine, which is the brain's neurotransmitter for reward and reinforcement. Your brain screams, "This is amazing, keep doing this."
But at the same time, the stomach isn't sending the signal to stop.
Correct. Because these foods are entirely stripped of their natural fiber and structural matrix, they digest almost instantly in the upper GI tract. They never make it down to the lower gut in a form that triggers the release of GLP-1 or peptide YY. Those are the hormonal messengers that travel to the brain and say, okay, we have enough nutrients, you are full, stop eating.
So you have the ultimate chemical reward signal combined with absolute zero satiety signaling.
Exactly. It is a physiological hijacking. When people struggle to stop eating a bag of processed chips, it is not a moral failing or a lack of willpower. Their biology is being actively manipulated by the engineering of the food.
I think that explanation is going to be a huge relief for a lot of people listening who feel guilty about their cravings. And Dr. Fung sees the consequences of these hormonal shifts very clearly in his clinical practice, particularly with a specific demographic. He observes that many women going through perimenopause experience sudden, stubborn, unexplained weight gain, even if they haven't changed their diet at all.
Yes, and the tragedy here is the traditional medical advice they receive. They go to their doctor and are told to just eat less and exercise more, which completely ignores the profound biological shift occurring in their bodies. Dr. Fung explains that as estrogen levels naturally begin to fluctuate and drop during perimenopause, it acts as a potent appetite stimulant. The brain thinks it's starving.
But it's not just about appetite, right? The actual distribution of the fat changes.
Correct. Estrogen dictates where fat is stored. When estrogen levels are robust, fat is typically stored in the subcutaneous layers, the hips, the thighs. As estrogen drops, the body fundamentally changes its storage strategy, pushing that fat directly into the visceral area.
The belly fat.
That is the deep inflammatory belly fat that surrounds the internal organs. So women find themselves gaining weight rapidly in the midsection despite no change in caloric intake, entirely because the hormonal landscape has shifted.
So if it's a hormonal issue driven by insulin and dropping estrogen, how do you combat it without just starving yourself? Dr. Fung's actionable data here points to the strategic use of what he calls protein-sparing modified fasts. He suggests protocols like consuming only high-quality bone broth for a specific window of time. How does bone broth fix the thermostat?
It's an incredibly strategic metabolic hack. By removing all carbohydrates and significant fats temporarily, you allow those chronic insulin levels to finally plummet. When insulin drops, the biological locks on the fat cells open, and the body can finally access stored visceral fat for energy.
But why not just water fast? Why the bone broth?
Because a pure water fast can be highly stressful and can lead to muscle breakdown. By providing a small amount of highly bioavailable amino acids and minerals through the bone broth, you accomplish two things. First, you prevent the body from cannibalizing its own muscle tissue to create glucose. Second, the protein in the broth stimulates just enough satiety to keep the hunger signals manageable. You are essentially resetting the body fat thermostat without triggering a famine response.
Okay, so we're talking about regulating the thermostat as adults. But our next source takes this concept of metabolic environments all the way back to the very beginning of human development. We're looking at the work of Jessie Inchauspé, who many people know as the glucose goddess.
Oh, her work is phenomenal.
It really is. She dives deep into gestational epigenetics, specifically how a mother's blood sugar impacts the literal future of her child. First, she outlines a core nutritional protocol for pregnant women, heavily emphasizing choline, specifically recommending 4 eggs a day, along with high protein and omega-3s. Why the intense focus on eggs and choline?
Choline is an absolutely vital yet chronically overlooked nutrient for fetal development. It is a primary building block for the construction of the baby's cell membranes. More importantly, it is crucial for the proper neural tube development and the construction of the brain and spinal cord. Combining high doses of choline with omega-3 fatty acids provides the exact structural raw materials required to build a robust, healthy nervous system from scratch.
But her most profound work isn't just about the building blocks, it's about the environment those blocks are assembled in, the glycemic environment. And this is where the research gets incredibly intense. The notes point to a major study out of Oslo University Hospital. They tracked 200 women who were receiving C-sections. The researchers measured the mother's blood sugar at the time of delivery and then immediately compared it to the baby's umbilical cord blood sugar. What did they find?
They found an undeniable perfect correlation. A mother's blood sugar perfectly mirrors the baby's umbilical cord blood sugar.
Meaning the baby is eating exactly what the mom is eating, hormonally speaking.
Exactly. It raises a very critical conversation about how we culturally view pregnancy cravings and the gestational diet. We often treat pregnancy as a free pass to eat whatever you want, but the placenta is not a perfect magical filter. Whatever metabolic environment the mother is creating in her bloodstream, the developing fetus is submerged in that exact same environment.
Right.
If the mother is experiencing massive erratic glucose spikes from eating ultra-processed carbohydrates or giving into sugary cravings, the baby's fragile, developing pancreas is riding that exact same glycemic roller coaster.
So what does this all mean? I'm looking at the long-term data on this, and the epigenetic reality is equal parts terrifying and empowering. The research shows that babies who are exposed to high glucose environments in the womb are 4 times more likely to develop diabetes as adults. 4 times. That is a massive statistical jump. How does a sugar spike in the womb cause a disease 30 years later?
This is the very essence of epigenetics. The high glucose environment isn't mutating the baby's actual DNA. The genetic code remains the same. But that environment is placing chemical tags on top of the DNA that permanently alter how those genes are expressed later in life.
So it's programming the software, not changing the hardware.
That's a brilliant way to put it. The fetal metabolic system is being programmed in real time. The baby's body is interpreting the mother's blood sugar and learning, before it is even born, that it's entering a high-sugar, high-stress world. So it proactively alters its metabolic set points. It pre-programs insulin resistance into the child's biology as a survival mechanism. That early programming is what leads to the massive 4-fold increase in diabetes risk decades later.
It is a staggering level of responsibility for a mother. But what I love about Incospe's work is that she doesn't just deliver the scary data. She provides a very clear, actionable takeaway to prevent it. She says the key is to simply flatten those glucose spikes. And her primary strategy is incredibly straightforward. Always start the day with a savory breakfast, and never eat carbohydrates naked. Always pair them with a protein.
It's all about managing the velocity of the fuel. It's about changing the speed at which glucose enters the bloodstream. If you eat a naked carbohydrate, like a plain bagel, a bowl of sugary cereal, or even a glass of orange juice on an empty stomach, that glucose floods the system immediately. It causes a massive spike in blood sugar, followed by a heavy insulin release and a subsequent crash.
Which the baby feels entirely.
Yes. But by starting the day with a savory, protein-heavy breakfast, like those 4 eggs she recommends, you stabilize your fasting insulin right out of the gate. And later in the day, if you want a carbohydrate, pairing it with a protein or a healthy fat creates a physical digestive bottleneck in the stomach. The protein takes longer to break down, which slows the gastric emptying process. This allows the glucose from the carbohydrate to trickle into the bloodstream slowly and steadily, rather than crashing in like a tidal wave. You flatten the glycemic curve, protecting both the mother's energy levels and the baby's epigenetic future.
Okay, so we've covered fueling the microscopic cells, and we've covered the immense responsibility of fueling a developing fetus. But what about fueling our actual physical structure as we age? This brings us to the research of J.J. Virgin and her work on beating what she calls anabolic resistance. She explains that once you cross the threshold of age 40, your muscles essentially become stubborn. They develop this anabolic resistance, meaning they no longer respond to the signals to grow and repair the way they did when you were in your 20s. What exactly is happening in the muscle to cause this?
Anabolic resistance is one of the most fundamental biological barriers to healthy aging. When you are 20 years old, your cellular machinery is primed for growth. The mere presence of a small amount of food or a very slight physical stimulus like a light workout is enough to tell your muscles, okay, let's synthesize new protein and build. The sensors are highly sensitive.
You could basically look at a weight and build muscle at 20.
Pretty much. But as we age, and particularly as we cross that 40-year mark, those cellular sensors in the muscle tissue become physically blunted. The signal isn't loud enough to get through the resistance anymore. You can't just eat the exact same way you did in your youth and expect your body to maintain its structural integrity.
Which means you have to turn the volume up on the signal. Virgin states that to overcome this blunted response, you must consume significantly more amino acids in a single sitting. And she points to one specific amino acid as the master key, leucine. She argues that you have to hit a hard threshold of 2.5 grams or more of leucine in a single meal to trigger something called the mTOR pathway. Translate this for me. What is the mTOR pathway, and what does 2.5 grams of leucine actually look like?
The mTOR pathway, which stands for mammalian target of rapamycin, is essentially the central command switch for cellular growth in the human body. It is the molecular trigger that tells a muscle cell, stop breaking down, it is time to build and repair. And leucine is the specific amino acid that acts as the key to turn that switch.
So if mTOR is the ignition, leucine is the key.
Exactly. But here is the critical part about anabolic resistance. The switch isn't a dimmer. It's binary. It's either on or off. If you eat a small meal that contains only 1.5 grams of leucine, the switch doesn't flip halfway. It doesn't flip at all. It requires a hard threshold of roughly 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine in one sitting to overcome that age-related blunting and activate mTOR.
Okay, practically speaking, how much food is that?
Yeah.
Because I know people who just eat a handful of almonds or a tiny cup of yogurt and think they're getting their protein in.
And that is exactly why so many older adults suffer from muscle wasting. A handful of almonds might have a few grams of total protein, but it has a microscopic amount of leucine. To hit 2.5 grams of leucine, you are looking at consuming roughly 30 to 40 grams of high-quality, complete protein in a single meal.
Wow.
That's a large chicken breast. That's a substantial piece of salmon. That's a large scoop and a half of high-quality whey protein. Grazing on tiny amounts of protein throughout the day completely fails to hit the leucine threshold required to stimulate growth.
So you have to consolidate your protein to force the signal through. But eating massive amounts of meat 3 times a day can be heavy on the digestion, especially as we get older. To get around this, Virgin leans on clinical data from the NIH and the studies of Dr. Donald Lyon. She suggests a highly strategic hack, utilizing essential amino acids, or EAAs, in supplement form. Why take EAAs instead of just eating another chicken breast?
This is a brilliant tactical approach, especially for longevity. Digesting whole food protein takes a massive amount of physiological energy. Your body has to produce stomach acid, release enzymes, break down the complex meat structures, and slowly absorb the amino acids. And as we age, our natural production of stomach acid and digestive enzymes declines.
So even if you eat the chicken breast, you might not be extracting the leucine efficiently.
Exactly. But by taking free-form essential amino acids in a powder or capsule, you are providing the body with the exact building blocks the muscle needs. Completely pre-digested, they bypass the digestive burden entirely. They enter the bloodstream rapidly, spiking the amino acid levels high enough and fast enough to easily cross that 2.5 gram leucine threshold and trigger mTOR. It is arguably the most effective way to prevent sarcopenia, which is age-related muscle wasting, especially if you are someone practicing caloric restriction or fasting.
It's like mainlining the exact construction materials directly to the worksite without having to wait for the delivery truck.
Exactly.
And keeping that physical structure strong is obviously vital. But you and I were talking before we started recording this deep dive, and we both agreed on a fundamental truth. The physical body, the cellular engines, the metabolic fuel systems, the muscle mass, it is all ultimately there to serve and protect the command center. Everything we've discussed so far is required to power the brain. Which brings us to a major transition in our blueprint. Let's talk about the command center. Brain health, sleep, and our relationship with light.
And this is where the downstream consequences of everything we discussed in the fuel section become truly alarming. We mentioned earlier how energy-hungry the brain is. If the metabolic fuel system is corrupted by years of high insulin and processed foods, the command center is the very first thing to fall offline.
And no one explains the mechanics of this better than Dr. Ben Bikman. He is at the forefront of the research that is now classifying Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes. This concept just shatters how we conventionally view cognitive decline. He argues that Alzheimer's isn't just a mysterious brain disease, it is deeply inextricably rooted in brain insulin resistance.
It connects directly back to Dr. Fung's thermostat. We know that if you spend decades spiking your blood sugar with ultra-processed foods, the cells in your liver and your muscles eventually become deaf to the insulin signal. They become insulin resistant. What Dr. Bickman's work illuminates is that this resistance doesn't stay at the neck. It happens in the brain. The neurons themselves lose their ability to use insulin to pull glucose inside.
I want to show a specific study from the notes that illustrates this perfectly, because the imagery is terrifyingly clear. Dr. Suzanne de la Monte conducted a study using rats. She was able to induce full-blown, undeniable Alzheimer's disease in these rats using one single intervention. She didn't alter their genetics. She didn't expose them to heavy metals. She simply blocked their brain insulin receptors. She stopped their brains from processing insulin, and they developed Alzheimer's.
That study represents a massive shift in neurological science. For decades, the entire focus of Alzheimer's research has been on clearing amyloid plaques and tau tangles from the brain. But what this research suggests is that the plaques might not be the root cause of the disease. They might be the downstream biological debris of a brain that is literally starving to death because it can no longer open the door to let glucose in.
And you can actually see that starvation happening. The sources cite PET scans conducted by researcher Stephen Kinane. He looked at the brain scans of patients with Alzheimer's, and the imagery showed a 32% reduction in glucose uptake in the brain. Over a third of the brain's energy supply was just gone. It's a localized famine. But here's the incredible pivot in the research. Here is the hope. Kinane's scans also revealed that while the glucose pathway was completely broken, the brain's ability to use a different fuel source, ketones, remained 100% normal and functional.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where we tie back to the dietary strategies we just discussed. Ketones are an alternative, highly efficient fuel source produced by the liver when carbohydrates are heavily restricted, like during the bone broth fast Dr. Fung recommended, or the low-carb diets Dr. Bickman advocates.
So if the glucose door is locked, how do the ketones get in?
Because ketones don't use the insulin door. They enter the brain through a completely different physiological pathway called monocarboxylate transporters. They entirely bypass the broken insulin-resistant receptors. They flow straight into those starving neurons, enter the mitochondria, and turn the lights back on.
So by strategically shifting the diet and providing the brain with ketones, you can literally rescue starving neurons in an Alzheimer's brain. That is just incredible. But fuel is only half the equation for the brain. The command center also requires profound, systemic rest to clean itself. And that brings us to the epidemic of non-restorative sleep, researched heavily by Dr. Matthew Walker. We aren't just talking about insomnia here. We are talking about the incredibly frustrating phenomenon where you do everything right. You go to bed on time, you sleep a full 7 to 8 hours, but you wake up feeling completely exhausted, groggy, and mentally foggy. What is going wrong here?
This is a silent epidemic that ruins the quality of life for millions of people. The problem is that we mistakenly assume that the duration of sleep equals the quality of sleep. But sleep architecture is incredibly complex. To actually recover, your brain has to cycle smoothly through light sleep, into deep, slow-wave sleep, and up into REM sleep. Deep sleep is when the physical body repairs tissue. It is also when the glymphatic system activates.
The glymphatic system.
Think of it as the brain's sewage system. During deep sleep, the glial cells in the brain actually shrink, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to wash through the brain and clear away all the metabolic waste and amyloid proteins that accumulated during the day. If you are sleeping for 8 hours but never achieving enough deep sleep, that power washing never happens. You are unconscious, but you are absolutely not resting. You wake up with a brain full of yesterday's garbage.
And the statistical data on how widespread this is shocking. Researcher Maurice O'Haon conducted a massive 25,000-person survey and found that this specific non-restorative sleep affects 1 in 10 adults. And the medical implications are severe. It's not just that you need an extra cup of coffee. The data shows it is a strong, independent predictor of major depressive disorder. Furthermore, there was a massive longitudinal study in Japan that tracked 86,000 people. They linked this specific type of poor sleep directly to major cardiac and cerebrovascular events. We're talking about heart attacks and strokes. How does bad sleep cause a heart attack?
Because everything in the blueprint is connected. If the brain cannot clear its waste, and if the nervous system cannot downregulate out of that sympathetic spiral of doom during the night, the cardiovascular system remains under constant, low-grade, high-pressure stress. Over the course of years, that unrelenting physical tension damages the delicate endothelium, the inner lining of the blood vessels. That damage attracts plaque, which eventually ruptures and causes those exact cardiac events. Sleep is a cardiovascular event.
That is a sobering connection. But if you're listening to this right now and thinking, okay, that's me, I sleep 8 hours and I wake up feeling like I was hit by a truck, Dr. Walker has some incredibly empowering news. He found through his research that this specific morning grogginess is 75% modifiable. You don't need a sleeping pill. You can fix 75% of this problem through just 2 lifestyle interventions: your daytime physical activity and your breakfast composition.
This perfectly illustrates the reality of circadian biology. Most people think about sleep hygiene at 10 p.m. They think about blue light blockers and chamomile tea, but your sleep quality is actually dictated by the biological momentum you begin building from the exact moment you wake up.
Right, so how does exercise and breakfast fix my sleep tonight?
Vigorous daytime physical activity creates what we call sleep pressure. The more you physically exert yourself during the day, the more adenosine builds up in the brain, which makes your body biologically crave deeper, more restorative, slow-wave sleep that night. And as for breakfast, it goes right back to the glucose goddess. If you eat a sugary breakfast and ride a glycemic roller coaster all day, your body releases cortisol and adrenaline to manage the crashes. Those stress hormones linger in your system and actively prevent you from descending into deep sleep. A savory breakfast stabilizes the hormones, setting the stage for deep rest 16 hours later.
It's a 24-hour cycle. And the ultimate master switch that controls that entire 24-hour biological clock is light. Which brings us to Dave Asprey's work on mastering the light environment. This is a crucial piece of the command center blueprint. His core, non-negotiable rule is this: you must get 10 to 30 minutes of natural sunlight directly in your eyes within the first hour of waking up.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people wake up, look at their bright phone screen in the dark, and think, that's enough light. Why does it have to be the sun?
Because of the specific spectrum and intensity of sunlight. This is arguably the single most fundamental biological directive human beings have. We evolved under the sun. Inside your retina, there are very specific receptors called melanopsin receptors. They are not designed for seeing shapes or colors. They are designed purely to measure the brightness and the angle of the sun. When natural, full-spectrum morning light hits those receptors, it sends an electrical signal directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain.
Let's pause on that because that's a mouthful. The prechiasmatic nucleus, is that essentially the brain's master clock?
Exactly. It sits right above where the optic nerves cross. It is the conductor of the circadian symphony. When that morning light signal hits the master clock, it triggers 2 critical biological events simultaneously.
Right, let's break those down because this is the biological timer Asprey talks about in the notes. First, that blast of sunlight triggers a healthy, necessary spike in morning cortisol. Now, cortisol gets a bad rap as the stress hormone, but we need it in the morning. Right, that's what actually wakes you up and clears away that groggy feeling. Second, and this is the part that blows my mind, looking at the sun in the morning starts a 14-hour countdown timer for the production of melatonin, the sleep hormone.
It's an elegant system. You literally cannot optimally produce melatonin at 10 p.m. if you do not properly anchor your cortisol at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
We are quite literally beings of light. Our entire endocrine system takes its cues from the sun. When we ignore our light environment, when we wake up in a pitch-black room, immediately stare at a blue-lit phone, commute in a dark car, work under artificial fluorescent lights all day, and then blast our eyes with bright television screens until midnight, we fundamentally break our biological clocks.
The brain is completely confused.
The brain has absolutely no idea what time it is, what season it is, or what it should be doing, so it panics. It dysregulates hormone production across the board.
And the consequences of breaking that clock are severe. Asprey brings in some wild historical studies to prove the impact of circadian disruption. He points to NASA research showing that severe circadian disruption and profound fatigue were major contributing factors to fatal errors in spaceflight history, specifically citing the devastating Challenger explosion. The people running the command center were so chronically circadian disrupted that their cognitive function and decision-making capabilities fundamentally failed.
It highlights the fragility of human cognition. When you decouple the human brain from its natural light-dark cycle, the degradation is rapid. Reaction times plummet, critical thinking deteriorates, and your emotional regulation completely collapses. It is a biological freefall.
And it doesn't just affect astronauts. It affects our day-to-day mental health drastically.
Right.
Asprey cites a fascinating Japanese study that looked at something as innocuous as ambient streetlight. They found that people who are exposed to ambient streetlight bleeding through their windows into their bedrooms at night had their depression rates increased by an astonishing 69%. Just from the glow of a street lamp. How is that physically possible?
Because even that tiny amount of artificial light at the wrong time of night suppresses the release of melatonin. And this is a crucial point. Melatonin is not just the sleep hormone that makes you drowsy. It is one of the most powerful systemic antioxidants and anti-inflammatory molecules the human body produces, particularly for the brain.
So it's protecting the brain while you sleep.
Exactly. If you suppress your melatonin production with artificial street light or a glowing TV, the oxidative stress in your brain rises, neuroinflammation increases. And modern psychiatry is increasingly understanding that depression is very often the clinical emotional manifestation of a physically inflamed, dysregulated brain.
So buy some high-quality blackout curtains and take your coffee outside in the morning. It sounds almost too simple, but the biological impact is massive. Okay, so if we take a step back and look at the blueprint so far, we've dialed in the mitochondrial engines, we've provided the right metabolic fuel, and we've optimized the command center with sleep and light. When all of those foundational pieces are aligned, the body's internal communication system can finally do its job properly. Which leads us into part 4 of our deep dive. Let's talk about the messengers and the builders, hormones and peptides.
This is a really exciting transition because this is where we move from basic foundational maintenance into targeted systemic repair. Hormones are the master directors. They dictate the pace at which we age, the rate of our metabolism, and the structural quality of our tissues.
And our first expert in this section, Dr. Amy Horniman, has a very clear, very passionate message for anyone listening. She says, do not accept normal lab results if you are personally suffering from extreme fatigue, brain fog, and unexplained weight gain. She stresses that the standard reference ranges you see on a blood test from your doctor are simply an average of a very sick modern population. They are absolutely not a metric of optimal health.
This is one of the greatest systemic failures of modern endocrinology. The normal range on a lab result is just a statistical bell curve. It is built by averaging the blood work of the thousands of people who went to that specific lab, most of whom were there because they were sick. If your results fall anywhere within that massive sweeping curve, a conventional doctor will look at the paper, tell you everything is fine, and send you home. But if you are experiencing profound physiological dysfunction, if your hair is falling out, you can't get out of bed, your body is loudly telling you that something is broken, regardless of what the paper says.
Dr. Horniman knows the danger of that bell curve intimately because of her own personal story, which is outlined in the notes. She was a competitive fitness model. She's doing everything right according to the standard fitness industry advice. She was eating a highly restrictive, low-calorie diet and doing brutal 2-a-day cardio sessions, and her body just completely broke down. Despite working out twice a day, she started rapidly gaining weight, and she was literally losing her hair in clumps. What was happening biologically?
It's a classic presentation of severe stress-induced thyroid dysfunction. The extreme caloric restriction combined with chronic overtraining pushed her body deep into that sympathetic spiral of doom we discussed with Dr. Scher. Her nervous system surveyed the environment, saw no food and constant physical running, and decided she was in a famine and under constant threat. So, as a survival mechanism, the brain downregulated her thyroid hormone production. It intentionally slowed her metabolism to a crawl to conserve energy and keep her alive.
And she actively tried to get help. The notes say she went to 6 different endocrinologists, 6 specialists, and every single one of them looked at her labs, saw she was somewhere in that massive normal range, and essentially dismissed her pain. They told her to do exactly what was destroying her, eat less and exercise more. It wasn't until she found a 7th doctor who actually looked at her symptoms rather than just the bell curve that the lock was finally picked. That doctor prescribed T3 thyroid medication, and her body was finally able to heal and release the weight. Why did the first 6 doctors miss it?
Because they were likely looking at the wrong messenger. The thyroid gland produces a hormone called T4, but T4 is essentially an inactive storage hormone. For it to do anything, it has to travel through the bloodstream to the peripheral tissues like the liver and the gut and be converted into T3. T3 is the active, potent form of the hormone that actually enters the cells, enters the mitochondria, and turns on the metabolic machinery.
So her body was making T4, but it wasn't converting it.
Exactly. The high-stress and restrictive diet halted the conversion process. Many conventional doctors only test TSH or T4, and they blindly assume the conversion to T3 is happening flawlessly. Dr. Horniman's case highlights the absolute necessity of demanding a full thyroid panel that looks at the active messenger, free T3. When that 7th doctor provided the exact active messenger her body was failing to produce, the cellular engines finally received the command to turn back on.
It's a powerful lesson in self-advocacy. You know your body's baseline better than a reference range on a piece of paper. And speaking of sudden, chaotic bodily changes that doctors often dismiss, we have to look at the work of Karen Martell and what she calls the perimenopause cliff. She points out a massive cultural misconception. Most women believe perimenopause starts in their late 40s or 50s. But Martel notes that it typically begins much, much earlier, between the ages of 38 and 42, and the very first domino to fall isn't estrogen, it's a drop in progesterone.
And this drop is incredibly insidious because it happens while women are still having completely regular monthly cycles. So it completely flies under the radar of both the patient and the doctor. Progesterone is the calming, soothing, neuroprotective hormone of the female body. It is the necessary counterbalance to estrogen. It promotes deep, restorative sleep, it regulates mood and anxiety, and it acts as a mild natural diuretic. When progesterone begins to sharply and erratically decline around age 40, the physiological chaos begins.
Martel's personal story illustrates this cliff perfectly. At age 42, she was doing everything right. She had an immaculate paleo diet, she had a strict fitness routine, but suddenly, seemingly overnight, she gained 15 pounds directly around her midsection. She developed severe insomnia. She was waking up completely wired and anxious at 2 a.m. every single night. She was hit with heavy brain fog and deep depression.
And I want to pause here and emphasize this point for anyone listening who feels frustrated by their lack of progress. Lifestyle cannot outwork a profound hormonal deficit. You can have the most pristine organic diet in the world, just like Karen Martel did, but if the actual chemical messengers that dictate how your cells behave are missing, your body will malfunction. The 2 a.m. waking she experienced is a classic textbook sign of low progesterone. Progesterone is supposed to keep cortisol in check during the night. Without it, a tiny spike in cortisol jolts you completely awake. And the midsection weight gain is driven by the state of estrogen dominance created when progesterone drops, combined with the rising insulin resistance we discussed earlier.
So how did she get her life back? The notes say she completely reversed these symptoms by utilizing bioidentical progesterone. That alone restored her sleep and lifted the depression. And eventually, as her perimenopause journey continued, she added estradiol, the primary form of estrogen, to protect against accelerated aging and bone loss. Why bioidentical specifically?
Because words matter in medicine. Bioidentical hormones are synthesized from plant sources to be molecularly, structurally identical to the hormones your body naturally produces. Your cellular receptors recognize them perfectly. This is vastly different from synthetic progestins or synthetic estrogens, which have slightly different molecular structures and can carry different risks and side effects. By replenishing the exact missing messengers, she didn't just mask her symptoms with a sleeping pill or an antidepressant. She restored the internal biological environment. And as she added estradiol, she was protecting her deep structures. Estrogen is incredibly protective. It maintains the elasticity of the blood vessels, the density of the bones, and the collagen integrity of the skin.
Okay, let's pivot slightly, because we've talked about systemic hormones that broadcast signals to the whole body. But I'm looking at the next section of the notes, and here's where it gets really interesting. We now have access to molecules that send hyper-targeted local signals for rapid repair. This brings us to the future of healing. Peptides. Our sources feature the clinical work of Kiel van der Lees and Dr. Stephanie Estima. They outline how to utilize specific peptides for tissue repair. But before we get into the specifics, they outline one crucial, unbreakable rule for using peptides. You must cycle them. For example, 5 days on, 2 days off. Why can't you just take them every day if they are healing you?
Because if you do, they stop working. This is a fundamental principle of pharmacology and human biology. If you constantly, relentlessly bombard a cellular receptor with a stimulus, the cell will eventually downregulate that receptor to protect itself from overstimulation. It essentially pulls the receptor inside the cell or turns off the alarm. It becomes deaf to the signal. By cycling the peptides, giving the body a strict 2-day break, you maintain receptor sensitivity. You ensure that when the peptide arrives, the cells remain eager and highly responsive to the repair signal.
That makes perfect sense. Keep the body guessing a bit. Now, the specific peptides they discuss are just mind-blowing. Let's look at BPC 157 first. The notes say this peptide acts locally in the gut to seal tight junctions, which sounds huge for anyone dealing with leaky gut issues. But systemically, if injected, it travels through the body and upregulates something called fibroblast growth factor, or FGF, which triggers rapid, almost unnatural repair of joints and tendons. What exactly is BPC 157?
BPC stands for Body Protection Compound. And what's fascinating is that this isn't a foreign drug. It is a peptide sequence that is naturally found in human gastric juice. Its evolutionary biological purpose is to rapidly heal the stomach lining, because the stomach is a severe, highly acidic environment that is constantly sustained in microdamage.
So it's a natural healing agent.
Exactly. But when it is isolated, synthesized, and administered systemically, it acts like sending an elite, highly specialized team of biological welders directly to injured tissue. Fibroblast growth factor, which BPC 157 upregulates, dictates the proliferation of the specific cells that build collagen and connective tissue. Tendons and ligaments notoriously have terrible blood supply, which is why they take months or years to heal. By massively upregulating FGF, BPC 157 dramatically accelerates the timeline for healing microtears in tendons, ligaments, and the mucosal lining of the gut.
So you have BPC 157 acting as the structural welder. Then, the notes reference a study by researchers Pickett and Vasquez regarding a totally different peptide, GHKQ, which is a copper peptide. The data here is almost hard to believe. They proved that GHKQ modulates over 900 longevity genes. It acts like a master genetic switch, triggering massive collagen synthesis and stem cell activation for the skin and the gut. Now, what does it actually mean to modulate 900 genes? That sounds too broad to be effective.
It does sound broad, but that is the nature of what we call a pleiotropic molecule. Pleiotropic simply means it has multiple, wide-ranging effects across different systems. It doesn't just knock on one door. It interacts directly with the epigenome to alter the expression of nearly 1,000 different genes simultaneously.
So it's conducting a massive section of the symphony all at once.
Precisely. As we age, our gene expression shifts. Inflammatory genes get turned up and tissue repair genes get turned down. GHKQ essentially reverses that specific dynamic. It heavily downregulates inflammatory genes and heavily upregulates the genes responsible for tissue remodeling, collagen production, and youthful cellular function. It essentially commands older senescent cells to act young again, mobilizing the body's latent stem cells to flood into damaged areas and lay down fresh, healthy tissue.
It really feels like we are reading the literal blueprint for constructing a superhuman. We have the engines, the fuel, the hormones, and the targeted peptide welders. But as you and I discussed before, you can provide the body with all the perfect molecules, you can eat the perfect diet, and you can inject the most advanced peptides. But if the nervous system is locked in trauma, the physical body absolutely refuses to heal. And that brings us to the final and frankly most profound section of our deep dive, Part 5. We are looking at the unseen layers. We are exploring trauma, suppressed emotion, and strangely enough, oral health.
This section is where the biological rubber meets the psychological road. In Western medicine, we have a terrible habit of viewing the physical body and the mind as two completely separate, quarantined entities. But the growing field of neuroimmunology proves that they are completely physically entangled. The molecules of emotion, the neuropeptides that are released when we experience chronic stress, deep joy, or severe trauma, they physically bind to receptors on our immune cells and our endocrine glands. Your immune system is literally listening to your thoughts.
And Dr. Deanna Minich illustrates this connection powerfully in her clinical work. She focuses on the somatic manifestation of emotion. She argues that emotional stagnation feelings, angers, or traumas that are trapped and left unprocessed can and will physically manifest as dense disease in the physical body, particularly in the endocrine and reproductive systems.
It's the concept that the body keeps the score. When a profound trauma or a heavy emotional stressor is ignored, suppressed, or compartmentalized, the nervous system doesn't just forget about it. It remains in a subtle, constant state of defensive vigilance. In Dr. Minich's specific area of study, it's important to understand that the pelvic region and the reproductive organs are heavily, densely innervated by the autonomic nervous system. Chronic emotional tension literally constricts blood flow to these areas and alters the local immune response in those tissues, creating a stagnant environment that is ripe for inflammatory fibrotic conditions.
Her own personal story is a testament to this, and it's incredible. Dr. Minich was suffering from severe endometriosis and had a physically blocked fallopian tube. The standard conventional medical path for a blocked tube is usually invasive surgery. But she began engaging in a very different kind of therapy. She recognized she had deep, unprocessed emotional stress, and she started finding a personalized, creative outlet to process it. She began painting large, messy, incredibly colorful abstract shapes on canvas as a form of emotional release. How does splashing paint on a canvas heal a physical blockage?
Because she was utilizing art therapy to intentionally bypass the logical, conscious brain. The conscious analytical brain is usually where we construct our defenses, where we rationalize our pain, and where we suppress our emotions. By engaging in intuitive nonverbal art, she was tapping directly into the subconscious, allowing the trapped emotional energy to be expressed physically.
And here is the jaw-dropping part of the story. She's painting these abstract shapes. Her husband walks into the room one day, looks at her messy canvases, and points out that she was subconsciously painting anatomically correct images of her uterus and her ovaries. She wasn't trying to paint anatomy. She was literally subconsciously painting the exact site of her physical trauma. And the result of this: 1 year after dedicating herself to this creative, emotional release, she went back to her doctor for a follow-up ultrasound. Her previously blocked fallopian tube had completely healed and cleared on its own. No surgery required.
It sounds like magic, but it is grounded in profound neurobiology. By externalizing the suppressed emotion through the physical act of art, she relieved the chronic subconscious stress on her autonomic nervous system. When her brain finally stopped sending constant danger signals to the pelvic region, the local immune system was able to stand down from its defensive, inflammatory posture. The body naturally reallocated its resources from protection mode back to repair mode. The inflammation naturally subsided, the fibrotic tissue broke down, and the tube healed itself.
It is absolute clinical proof that you cannot heal the tissue if you don't heal the trauma. And no one embodies the raw, gritty reality of trying to outrun trauma, quite like Ken Rideout, our next source. His story is heavily featured in the notes, and it's a story about the power of mental resilience, but also the dangerous, destructive limits of that resilience. He believes that mental toughness and extreme discipline can absolutely save your life in the short term, but true peace requires unpacking your childhood trauma rather than just running from it.
Mental toughness is a powerful shield, but we must remember that a shield is not a cure. It allows you to survive in hostile conditions, it keeps you pushing forward, but it doesn't resolve the underlying wound that made you pick up the shield in the first place.
Rideout's story is intense. He overcame a brutal 10-year addiction to opioids where he was taking 30 to 50 Percocet pills a day. Just pause and think about the sheer physiological toll of processing that many pills. He finally saved his own life by checking into a detox facility and utilizing an opioid blocker called Vivitrol, which physically strips the brain's ability to get high from the opiates. He got clean. He broke the chemical dependency. And then he channeled that intense, obsessive, addictive personality directly into extreme endurance sports.
Which is a very common and highly functional pivot for people in recovery. He successfully replaced a destructive chemical addiction with a constructive behavioral addiction. The massive endorphin and dopamine releases generated by extreme endurance sports provided a safer, natural chemical reward for his brain, filling the void left by the opioids.
And he took it to the absolute extreme. In his 50s, Ken Rideout won the Gobi March, a grueling 155-mile foot race across one of those brutal deserts on Earth. He proved his mental toughness to the entire world. He was the picture of health. But the source material highlights the tragedy behind the trophy. He kept running, he kept winning, but he couldn't outrun his nervous system.
Because the ultra-endurance running was still ultimately just a coping mechanism. It kept him alive, it kept a needle out of his arm, but it didn't heal the root cause of the addiction. When he wasn't running, when he was sitting still and the endorphins wore off, he was still plagued by what he describes as a terrifying internal shame storm. The severe childhood trauma, the deep-seated psychological wounds were still radiating intense danger signals into his biology. And because he was in so much internal pain, he was tearing his family apart, projecting that internal chaos and anger outward onto the people he loved most.
Exactly. He had the ultimate physical discipline. He could run 150 miles, but he was still drowning emotionally. To actually save his family relationships and find true peace, he had to do the hardest thing possible. He had to stop running. He had to sit still, enter intensive trauma therapy, and unpack the painful childhood wounds that started the whole cycle of addiction in the first place. It just goes to show you can have the perfectly functioning mitochondria of a 20-year-old, you can have the endurance of an elite athlete, but if your mind is a war zone, your biology is still under siege.
It requires immense courage to drop the protective shield of mental toughness and actually face the raw vulnerability of trauma therapy. It's much easier to just run another marathon. But as Rideout's story proves, resolving that trauma is the only path to true, systemic, lasting longevity.
Now, as we reach the final layer of our unseen blueprint, we pivot to something that seems so mundane, so everyday, yet it is intimately connected to everything we've discussed today, from sleep architecture to cellular energy to nervous system regulation. And that is airway and oral care, as researched by Dr. Aof Stack and Dr. James Goulnick. Their bold claim in these notes is that longevity literally starts in the mouth.
And medically speaking, they are entirely correct. The mouth is the beginning of the digestive tract and the primary gateway to the respiratory system. The microbiome of the mouth, the specific balance of bacteria living on your teeth and tongue, dictates the inflammatory state of your entire cardiovascular system.
Dr. Stack provides a ridiculously simple, actionable piece of advice here. She says that using a physical tongue scraper, just a little piece of metal, every single morning, fundamentally changes your biology. Now, she notes it physically clears the bacterial biofilm, which changes how food tastes and impacts your satiety signaling. But the big claim is that it directly improves your body's production of nitric oxide, which lowers your blood pressure. How does scraping your tongue lower your blood pressure? That sounds like a stretch.
It's actually a brilliant piece of physiology. Nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator. It signals the smooth muscle inside your blood vessels to relax, widening the vessels and allowing blood to flow freely. This naturally lowers your blood pressure and heavily increases the delivery of oxygen-rich blood to your organs. The fascinating, often overlooked part is that a significant portion of our body's nitric oxide is produced by specific, highly beneficial bacteria that live exclusively on the back of the tongue.
So there are microscopic partners.
Yes. If you wake up and use harsh, alcohol-based mouthwashes, you nuke the microbiome. You kill those beneficial bacteria, your nitric oxide production plummets, and your blood pressure literally goes up. If instead you gently use a tongue scraper, you remove the pathogenic sludge that builds up overnight, allowing those nitric oxide-producing bacteria to thrive and do their job.
A $3 piece of metal can alter your cardiovascular health. It's amazing. But Dr. Goulnick takes the oral care aspect even deeper into the airway itself. He shares a very personal patient story about his own 11-year-old daughter. She was suffering from chronic mouth breathing. Now, a lot of people sleep with their mouths open, or their kids do, and they think absolutely nothing of it. But Dr. Goulnick understood the physiological damage this causes over time.
Mouth breathing is highly destructive. First, it bypasses the entire filtration, humidification, and temperature regulation system of the nasal cavity. You are pulling raw, unfiltered air directly into the lungs. But much more importantly, it shifts the state of the nervous system. Nasal breathing naturally stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, that calm, healing, rest and digest state we discussed with Dr. Scher. Mouth breathing, on the other hand, is structurally shallow and rapid. It constantly signals to the brain that you are under stress, keeping you locked in that sympathetic fight-or-flight spiral.
So Dr. Goulnick initiated a protocol with his daughter using mouth tape. He literally taped her lips shut to force nasal breathing. Now, I have to admit, the idea of taping a child's mouth shut sounds terrifying. How do you even initiate that safely?
You don't start at night, which is where people get scared. He started incredibly gently. He had her use a small piece of porous tape for just 1 hour a day while she was sitting calmly in the living room doing her homework. This gently trained her conscious brain and her physical airway to tolerate and prefer nasal breathing without any panic. Once she was fully comfortable and her airway adapted, they progressed to wearing the tape overnight.
It's a gradual retraining of the respiratory drive, and the result of just forcing her body to breathe through her nose at night. The notes say she experienced a massive, undeniable increase in her morning energy and focus.
Because everything in the blueprint ties back together right here. By forcing nasal breathing at night, she heavily increased her nitric oxide production in the nasal cavity, which dilated her blood vessels. This allowed a massive increase in oxygen delivery to her cells while she slept. That extra oxygen allowed her mitochondria, the engines we talked about in part 1, to produce maximum ATP. Furthermore, the slow, rhythmic nasal breathing kept her in a deep, calm, parasympathetic state all night, allowing for the deep, restorative sleep architecture that Dr. Walker emphasized. By simply closing her mouth, she optimized her entire biological symphony.
It is truly, profoundly interconnected. So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We've covered an absolute universe of information in the last hour. We have synthesized a blueprint that connects the incredibly micro-mitochondria, specific peptides, and single amino acids, all the way to the massive sweeping macro factors of your life, like exposing your eyes to the morning sun, expressing your deepest emotions on a canvas, and having the courage to confront the traumas you've been running from.
The overarching theme of all this research is control. For decades, the medical consensus taught us that our genetics and the inevitable decline of aging were completely out of our hands. We were told to just accept the decay. But this research proves that narrative is entirely false. You are not a helpless passenger in a decaying vehicle.
You are absolutely in the driver's seat. Whether you start your journey tomorrow by simply stepping out into the morning sunlight for 10 minutes, or hopping online to buy a $3 tongue scraper, or deciding to finally demand that your doctor run a full thyroid panel that actually includes free T3, you have the tangible tools to fundamentally rewrite your biological trajectory. You can rebuild the engines, you can change the fuel, and you can clear the trauma. Personally, I'm starting with a tongue scraper and making sure I hit that 2.5 grams of leucine at dinner.
And I'll be making sure I get outside before I look at my phone tomorrow morning. And as we wrap up this incredibly deep dive, I want to leave the listener with one final thought to mull over. We touched briefly on epigenetics today. The Oslo study showing how a mother's breakfast alters the genetic expression of her unborn child, and the GHKQ peptide altering the expression of over 900 longevity genes. I want you to truly pause and conceptualize what that means. If our daily, seemingly mundane choices, eating a savory breakfast, taking the time to sit and process an old trauma, looking at the sun instead of a screen, are instantaneously editing the expression of hundreds of our longevity genes and literally pre-programming the disease risk of generations that haven't even been born yet, then we are no longer just managing our health. We are acting as real-time evolutionary architects. Every single choice you make today is a physical keystroke on the human genome. What kind of future humanity are you coding for today?
Wow. That is the exact question we all need to be asking ourselves every morning. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the blueprint of your biology. We hope you feel empowered, educated, and ready to take full control of your vitality. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep thriving.